Okay, I'm Barry Goodison. I'm currently chair of the CMOS Ottawa Centre, and I'm really pleased to welcome everybody to what is our last, quote, luncheon event of the 21-22 season, and very much looking forward to it. And I can tell already by the discussion ahead of time that it could be a very interesting and fulfilling discussion afterwards as well. Just a couple of notes, and for those that came on late, this is being recorded. I assume you agree to that, and it will be posted on the CMOS YouTube channel for those that can't make it today. And just a reminder that for questions, we use the chat function, and type your question in there at any time. And I'll handle the Q&As at the end to make it a little easier for our speaker, that she can leave her talk up. And if somebody has a question about it at some point during it, that you can go back to it if needed. So we'll handle it that way. And I think that's everything that I wish to say. So I'm going to turn it over to actually our incoming chair, Leonard Barry. And so Len, take it on.
Thanks very much, Barry. It's really a great pleasure to introduce Ellen Field today. By way of introduction, I might point out that since climate change is really rapidly barreling down on us, as we all know, there's at no time has there been a greater need for understanding the problem and what to do about it. And education is a very key element in this. And Dr. Ellen Field, assistant professor at the Faculty of Education of Lakehead University, is focused on policy and practice of climate change education in her research. And Ellen teaches environmental and climate change education in the faculty of Lakehead. And in the last several years, she's engaged hundreds of teachers, we're really pleased to hear this, in professional development workshops. She's an associate editor of the Canadian Journal of Environmental Education. She's co-chair of the Canadian hub of the project Monitoring and Evaluating Climate Communication and Education, and co-founder of the professional learning community Climate Change Education Canada. So we're really looking forward to hearing more about this on the topic of the role of education in climate change, research-informed engagement. Ellen,
thanks, Barry.
The floor is all yours.
Thank you so much. So while I just get my slides up and running. Good. Can folks see those okay? Wonderful. So thanks for attending my talk. And the other piece of my introduction, which I didn't write in my bio, but which I have highlighted in my title under Zoom, is that I was born when there was 340 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. So I use this as a way to sort of mark my age. I'm not shy about how old I am, but please feel free to consider thinking about that for yourself. And if during the talk, if you get a little bit bored, I don't mind. You can go open up a new browser, go to the Mauna Loa Observatory and look at what year you were born and how much parts per million of CO2 there was. And feel free to pop that in the chat at any point as a way to keep the conversation going that way. So my talk today is called The Role of Education in Climate Action, Research-Informed Engagement. So I will outline some of the things we know from research about how climate change education is more effective. First, I would also like to acknowledge the enduring presence of Indigenous peoples on the lands from which we all gather virtually today across Turtle Island, and thank past, present, and future caretakers of this land. And I'm a white settler delivering this presentation. I'm in Orillia, Canada, which Lakehead has a southern campus. And I'm in Williams Treaty Territory, which is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe peoples. And the image on the screen is of the Magickaning fish weirs, which is located right between where Lake Simcoe flows into Lake Couchiching. And these are right where it really is. And these date all the way back to 3300 BC. So this site has been a fishing spot and meeting spot for thousands of years. And I'd like to put forward that if Anishinaabe laws were the dominant laws embodied on Turtle Island and around the world, we wouldn't be having the climate crisis we are today. We would have laws around 7 generations and policies that considered those 7 generations and not just half a generation or 2 generations. So I think there's a lot of listening and learning that we need to do as we collectively find ourselves and our ways through the climate crisis. So today in my talk, I'm going to briefly situate the climate urgency as well as solutions with a few highlights from the 6th assessment of the IPCC report. Since it's fairly new, I thought I would take this time to sort of highlight some of those big key findings and share those in this talk. Then we'll talk about education as an overlooked mitigation strategy. And then that will flow into what we know from policy research and practice, where we are now. And then I'll put forward some things that we can learn from the climate justice movement, rounding out the talk to talk about pathways for responsive education systems that meet the needs, excuse me, of our time. So first, I'm sure we're all aware of this, especially with this group, of the geophysical urgency of the climate crisis, but I just wanted to highlight that. As the greenhouse gas emissions we're emitting risk destabilizing the entire planet. And there are 15 big geophysical systems that regulate climate. 9 are on the move, and 3 may have already crossed tipping points. You're likely aware of the disappearance of Arctic summer sea ice, the imminence of the coral reef collapse, and the disintegration of the West Antarctic ice sheet. So these systems are linked like dominoes. And from this, we know we are destabilizing the entire planet. And that's why we have climate targets, to try to stop us from crossing tipping points that might cascade through the system and bring the whole house down, not eliminating us altogether, but with runaway warming impacting these systems and affecting our future quality of life. And that's why this is so extremely urgent. So to stay within the 1.5 degree temperature threshold is going to take and require big transformative shifts. And unfortunately, some countries are on the critically insufficient pathway in black. This is taken from the Climate Action Tracker. The black countries they have policies or they've implemented actions that will have warming to 4 or more degrees. The highly insufficient in red, which is warming to 4 degrees, which is where Canada currently is on the tracker, or insufficient, which is orange, warming to 3 degrees. I will say that the Climate Action Tracker assessment of Canada's policies was last updated in September 2021, and there's been quite a few policy shifts within Canada, including a couple of weeks ago, the 2030 climate emission reduction plan that the government put forward, which will shift some of the previous policy assessment for September 2021. I thought I would also sort of take this opportunity just to briefly outline some of these key findings of the IPCC that I outlined, just to convey both the urgency and as well what is coming forward in this latest assessment is also the agency in which humanity is currently operating. So greenhouse gas emissions are at their highest levels that they've been in human history. According to the Mauna Loa Observatory, as of this March, it was 418 parts per million CO2. So in my lifetime, that's a big shift from 340 parts per million CO2. May is also the highest point, so it's always interesting to go back and check. You have to check it in June, but to see what we are at for the year, because it always peaks in May. Emissions in 2019 were 12% higher than they were in 2010 and 54% higher than they were in 1990. So we are definitely not on track to limit warming to 1.5 degrees of warming. And among this crowd, I'm sure this is not news, but important context, especially just to give this highlight of what the latest IPCC is showing. But there is increased evidence of climate action. The average rate of growth in global emissions has slowed from 2.1% per year. Earlier part of this century to 1.3% per year from 2010 to 2019. This decline in growth is particularly noticeable in the energy and industry sectors where the rate of growth has more than halved. So again, highlighting some of the gains that we've had. However, despite this progress, unless there are immediate and deep emission reductions across all sectors, 1.5 degrees is most likely beyond reach unless there are immediate and deep emission reductions. So to outline what that looks like, based on previous policies that were implemented before 2020, the IPCC predicts warming of 3.2 degrees based on policies up to 2020. Looking at the scenarios assessed, limiting warming to 1.5 degrees requires global greenhouse gas emissions to peak before 2025 at the latest. So that's 3 years that we need in order to meet that, and to be reduced by 43% by 2030. So in addition to this, more recent research around methane emissions has shown that if we can reduce it by 34% by 2030, that has a fairly big impact in terms of our ability to reduce warming. And they also provided below the scenario of warming to 2 degrees, which I found really interesting, is still this peak before 2025. So really a 3-year window there. And the slight difference of the reduction of only 27% versus above the 43% by 2030. So that is the urgency piece. And I'll just briefly highlight some of the agency side of the report, in which it shows that there are options available in every sector that can get at least half emissions by 2030. So I found this very, very interesting to read this part of the report. And if you haven't had a chance to read it, I will just also say the IPCC has a press conference on their YouTube channel where they highlight all the major key findings in the report. And sometimes it's nice just to hear people talk than read the entire report. So if that's of interest to you, do check that out there. One of the really interesting pieces was this piece on demand and services. And this is a noticeable shift around our agency in addressing the climate crisis. So changes to our lifestyles and our behavior can bring down our carbon footprint and improve our health and well-being by 40 to 70% by 2050. So this is a little bit of the individual agency that we all have to help address this issue. But the IPCC is very clear, this is only possible if the systemic necessary policies, infrastructure, and technologies are in place. So that's very important. The biggest or largest behavioral shifts are switching to walking and cycling, and previous research has shown this before. Electrified transport, reducing air travel, as well as shifting, adapting houses, and as well as moving to plant-based and low meat diets. So from the IPCC, we have these ways being outlined that we individually and collectively can shift our behaviors. But this also needs to recognize that these individual shifts that we can do also require these system level shifts across sectors to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Very recent analysis of commitments made at COP26, so this came out just a week ago, show that if acted upon, so the policies and the commitments that were put forward at COP26, if they are acted upon, they would limit warming to below 2 degrees. So again, we're at this crossroads currently where we're really grasping both the urgency and our collective agency as we're starting to see the policies potentially in place that can veer us to 2 degrees, and hopefully we can bend the curve even further to 1.5. And I wanted to just take a moment of gratitude for Dr. James Hansen way back in 1988 when he spoke to a US Congressional Committee and spoke to say it was 99% certain that the warming trend was not a natural variation, but was caused by a buildup of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. It was clear then, and it's clear now, and it's really taken us even more than 30 years to really figure out how to translate those scientific findings into policy and action. And Jim Skia, co-chair of the IPCC Working Group on Mitigation back in 2018, said it so clearly that the science is clear, it is up to our political will. So he said, we've pointed out the enormous benefits of keeping to 1.5 degrees and also the unprecedented shift in energy systems and transport of how we need to go to achieve that. We show that it can be done with laws, physics and chemistry. Then the final tick box is political will. We cannot answer that, only our audience can, and that is the governments that receive it. So here we are at this moment, and I just wanted to quickly insert what the research is saying of what Canadians think, because for so long there's been this sort of lag around, well, the Canadian public isn't really there. They don't really understand climate change. However, we know that for polling all the way back to 2014, that Canadians overwhelmingly agree that climate change is a major problem and the level of concern is rising. Where there tends to be some shift is around the policy implementation or the policy tools to correct the amount of CO2 or greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Half the population tell pollsters climate change is a very serious threat, the highest result since 2014. And there are definite gaps in the public's knowledge, which I will get to later in my research. But this piece of that the Canadian public is divided is less of a concern as it is sort of our systems having a bit of inertia. So with the increased levels of the public's acceptance that climate change is happening and that we need to do something about it, why has it seemed so difficult to shift our own habits in our own homes, our own communities, and the governmental responses to climate change? And the response requires us to move away from understanding the science of climate change to considering the social implications, processes of systems change, as well as the various social and psychological responses we have to shifting our ways of doing things. And given that the systems that got us into the mess are not the systems that can get us out of the mess, this is where we need to adopt a learning mentality. We literally have to learn our way through it. So learning is the critical piece as to how we navigate this existential moment. So just a few reasons why our actions have been slow to change. And we were speaking about this briefly before the talk began. Broadly, governments have not acted at a speed and scale around climate change that would infer to the public that it is a crisis. So messaging has still allowed for the public to assume climate impacts are temporally or geographically distant, even when we've had, especially in the last year, where British Columbia was so clear they're facing the brunt of impacts through flooding, forest fires, and heat. Seth Klein, author of The Good War, Mobilizing Canada for the Climate Emergency, is currently leading a climate emergency unit at the David Suzuki Institute. And they've identified 4 ways that governments lead when facing an emergency. And this applies to World War II as well as to COVID-19. So they outline when governments are facing an emergency, they will spend what it takes, they will create new institutions to respond to the emergency and require change instead of encouraging it, and to tell the truth about the emergency. So there's a great video on the Climate Emergencies Unit website. If you want to check that out, I can share it after in the chat. And up until last month, so if we think about responding to the emergency, up until last month, Canada didn't have a plan that would ensure that we would meet our climate targets. So Prime Minister Trudeau's $9.1 billion plan that came out at the end of March, entitled 2030 Emissions Reduction Plan, attempts to get us back on track. And we've failed to meet any of our emission targets for the last 3 decades. Getting us back on track means reducing emissions by 40 to 45% below 2005 levels by 2030. So the plan draws upon both public spending and regulatory measures to launch Canada's economic transition towards net zero. So at least we have a policy plan in place that tracks us to where we need to go. However, there's still lots of questions about the details of the plan, including carbon capture, utilization, and storage, and its ability to deliver the 42% cut from current levels that it's expected to. But again, we're going to need the political will to ensure that we keep the politicians accountable to achieving these goals. So we've looked at how government action and policy have been slow, but I'd also like to highlight some other reasons which are often overlooked. And for the most part, over the last 40 years, education and communication about climate change has stuck within a traditional knowledge dissemination model, which comes from research, right? So we do the research, that research gets shared through journals, which very few people read. Then science communicators or communicators translate that, as well as journalists will then report on it. And the whole hope has been that through that transfer of knowledge, then governments and citizens will understand the knowledge, shift their attitudes, which will shift behavior. And we know that that's actually a very flawed engagement pathway. So what we need to do is actually shift value systems and change our communication strategies. So, but first, let's just talk about mainstream media. Predominantly has used a doomsday narrative framing to report on climate change news, and then it focuses on problem identification, just like our research models do. And so when it comes to climate change, many people develop defense mechanisms to manage the psychological tension they experience as they come to learn about the slow motion emergency threatening us and our planet's quality of life. And this existential anxiety is met with denial, distraction, exhaustion, and all of these are very normal psychological responses. Working all day, come home, put on the news, hear about how terrible it's going to be. Hey, I might choose to go to Netflix and watch some light, syrupy rom-com because my life's already hard. And this is a very normal psychological response. So instead of shaming people, we need to figure out how to better communicate. More recently, the dominant doomsday narrative has been replaced as solutions journalism has started to influence the way that journalists think about how to inform the public. So this series, What on Earth on CBC, is really that response to think about telling some of the good news stories. As well, there is a whole network of solutions-based journalists who are focusing on how to break what works in real time and bypassing some of the ways that what the sensationalism as well as the types of approaches that mainstream journalism generally takes around doomsday reporting. But I want to talk about climate anxiety and youth rates of climate anxiety. So they're extremely high. There's been lots of press around this. There was the first international survey that assessed rates of climate change anxiety in 16 to 25-year-olds, and it came out earlier this fall. The survey found that 60% of youth across countries are very to extremely worried about climate change, which is not really that surprising. A little less than half said that their negative feelings about climate change negatively affect their daily life and functioning. And this is a part of the survey that I found the most interesting and that got the least media coverage. Youth rated governmental responses to climate change negatively and reported greater feelings of betrayal than reassurance. The researchers went on then to show that climate anxiety and distress were correlated with perceived inadequate government response and associated feelings of betrayal. So therefore, young people's level of climate anxiety is related to the lack of leadership. So if we want to help young people feel better and ensure their future, but in the short term, we actually need to have leadership by adults. Also in this study, they had that 4 in 10 young people fear having children due to the climate crisis. The image on the right is a painting called Going Under, Does Anyone Care? And this was done by a second-year BEd student, Cameron Morgan. And she completed this in her fall assignment in my environmental ed class. And she wanted to depict the climate impacts and try to normalize that complex feelings about climate change are appropriate, since it can seem like the world is just carrying on when the climate impacts are so clear all around us. And in our class, we talk about ways to help process climate emotions that young people may have. And one of the ways that we've explored is art making, as a way to think about futures. This one doesn't necessarily imagine hopeful futures, but also as a kind of reflective space to process some of the more difficult emotions, but that is not so much like talking or speaking. And my students really have found that it's been a very important sort of intervention for them as they have come to learn about the climate urgency and the accompanying feelings that come with understanding the urgency. So some evidence illustrates that focusing on climate solutions and engaging in climate action provide these pathways for fostering individual and societal resilience. This is coming from Susan Clayton's work, a very well-known psychologist who looks at climate change. And Ellen Kelsey's book here, that's came out in 2020, Hope Matters, Why Changing the Way We Think is Critical to Solving the Environmental Crisis. And she writes about how we're learning more of how tackling climate anxiety and tackling climate change are actually inextricably linked. And the research study I just cited actually makes that link in the research. So Kelsey develops this very nuanced argument about media framing, focusing on problem identification, and this idea of a starting line fallacy. And this is the idea that we're starting from here and nothing has been done, when really we need to timestamp change better to be able to demarcate the ways that change is actually happening. One of the ways that we've done this is to look at the different COP meetings and look at the degrees of warming that were anticipated. So back in 2015 with the Paris Agreement, the world was on track for 6 degrees of warming, right? And so with each additional COP, we've actually had lower and lower levels of warming based on the policy interventions that come forward based on the COPs. And now we're looking at somewhere between 1.5 and 2.2 degrees of warming. We still need to bend the curve and listen to the science, but it's important to timestamp and to see these shifts so that we can see that there is change happening. So, and I think it's important here to talk about what active hope is versus like some just being optimistic or wishful thinking. So it's very much grounded in reality. And it also allows for, if we don't have a hopeful position on this, then we won't be able to engage in the possibilities of the future. We won't be able to actually think we can get it. So if we stay always in this doomsday mental framing, then that's where we will get to. So there is this need to envision and plan and hope. And so we need to have this engaged, active hope. So it's not a disengaged, wishful thinking approach. So again, as we collectively teeter and grapple with this existential dilemma, it's important to not give in to climate fatalism or climate doom. Michael Mann wrote last week in an article in Time, really arguing about this. So we really have both to hold on to the urgency, as I said, and the agency, and hold both so that we can continue to bend the curve. This is a picture of Alana Wood, who has coined the term okay doomer. You may have heard the term okay boomer, which is what a lot of Gen Zs will say to boomers, like, okay boomer. I don't know if you have grandchildren who you've heard this. And okay doomer is the sort of the same Gen Z group saying this to those who maintain a climate doomsday mentality. And Alana really puts forward that if we stay stuck in climate doom, then it only helps preserve a status quo reliant on consumerism and fossil fuels. And she's really active on TikTok, and together with other like-minded young people, they're really building the climate messaging that is imaginative and seeks a positively framed future. And I just want to be really clear here. I'm not suggesting we blue sky climate news, because in education, and if we're talking about as in teachers, or even as parents, we need to be reliable messengers to young people. So we can't pretend that this is not an emergency. We also have to honor that young people have the ability to hear negative news. We have to deliver the negative news in ways that is developmentally appropriate, but we have to be truthful. So this is the nuance in which education has to negotiate. But we can't also pretend that it's not happening and not engage learners at any age in it. So this is the piece that I think is really, really important for us to hang on to. And I just also like to highlight as well, one of the pieces of the Paris Climate Agreement that we often don't discuss, that in Article 12, it calls on all parties to enhance climate change education, training, public awareness, public participation, and public access to information. So really there is all signatories who sign Paris are supposed to put in policies which enhance climate change education. And within climate change policy, we generally go to the sectors such as energy, agriculture, and transportation, and they're typically the focus, and they need to be, but we really need to have a multi-pronged approach where we're also addressing educational policy. And to date in Canada, we've really failed in this regard. Oh, let me just also highlight. So many countries around the world have put forward what's called an action on climate empowerment strategy. And these address both formal education, informal education, and non-formal education, so that the country knows who is doing what are the gaps in what's being provided in education, what funding is needed to support the different education stakeholders. And currently Canada does not have an action on climate empowerment strategy. So here are the various different components of an ACE strategy. Many countries have them. We really need to get to work in Canada on developing this strategy. One of the issues is because we are a federated system. So with the federal government and the provinces are in charge of mandating provincially the formal education curriculum, it becomes difficult. But I would like to see stronger directive and from the federal government on how they're developing an ACE strategy, and at least even sharing that with the provinces to guide the ministries of education to implement climate change education. The only ministry that has actually put forward a policy statement on climate change education is in BC. And that came out in December of this year. And it's actually not a full statement. It's just saying we recognize in our reformed curriculum, they recently redid the curriculum, that there are foundational pieces for teaching climate change. But that's the extent to which it goes. There is very little in terms of how should teachers teach climate change? What are the core ideas that are necessary for a climate change education framework? So, and then across Canada and the other ministries, that is not articulated. There's no policy directive to the ministries indicating how to do that. The other piece to this is that UNESCO has already declared that by 2025, environmental education must be a core curriculum component in countries around the world. So let's get to work. Let's just do this. Let's figure out how to improve environmental and climate change education in our education systems. So, and I'm going to get to my research. Also, beyond any arguments based on the sort of moral imperative or duty to teach students about climate change, there is research which actually quantified the amount of emission reductions from climate change education courses and shown that climate change education for just 16% of secondary students in middle and high income countries today can lower their collective carbon footprints by nearly 19 gigatons over the next 30 years. And so you can see what I highlighted is that education, if you try to quantify it, it also starts to hold up as a potential additional mitigation strategy. It's just that we just haven't funded it or said, yeah, we're going to do this. And we're going to see how we can drive down our emissions, really concertedly looking at how we can improve climate change education. The other piece research has shown, which is really important for us to stand, is that there are ripple effects when we embed climate change education in our formal education system. So it doesn't just stop with the student. Parents of children in this research study expressed higher levels of climate concern than parents in a control group where their student was not part of a classroom that was doing climate change education. And the interesting piece about this is a US study, is that the effects were the strongest among male parents and conservative parents. And it was the daughters who appeared to be especially effective in influencing parents. So just to rephrase that, in the US, in some states with particularly strong Republican fathers, daughters were actually very effective at influencing their father's point of view on climate. So this is something to really consider, is these ripple effects that happen when we take education seriously. Oh, sorry about that. So I'll just quickly outline a national survey on climate change education that I led in Canada as a postdoc researcher back in 2019. And the survey was national. It resulted in establishing several benchmarks of climate change education in Canada from which future change can be measured. It also highlighted a lot of glaring gaps which need to be addressed. So there were over 3,000 Canadians, and I surveyed teachers, parents, youth, and 1,000 members of the general public to also get this larger sort of holistic view of education. So the survey identified that overall Canadians are concerned, recognize that climate change is happening. They're less sure of it being anthropogenically caused though. So that's an area for our education to improve, is making the connection that fossil fuels are causing climate change. There's also several big gaps in Canadians' knowledge and understanding of climate change, such as they're less certain that carbon dioxide and other gases cause climate change. Only 48% of Canadians correctly identified that they cause climate change. They're also less certain about how much heating your system can tolerate. So only 43% correctly identified 1 to 2 degrees that the Earth system could tolerate, and 42% identified they just didn't know. They just had no idea. So again, a gap that our public broadcasters could really improve, as well as our education system, that specific piece about climate change. And I guess the other piece I wanted to highlight is that if Canadians don't understand that climate change is caused by carbon dioxide or greenhouse gases, and if they don't understand how much heating the Earth can handle, then how can we also expect Canadians to vote or support for climate policies that align with the climate science if those basic understandings aren't there? When it comes to formal education, Canadians and educators agree that more should be done to educate young people about climate change. And this was a very high agreement. This was over 65% across all of our different groups. So students between grades 7 to 12, those were our youth, the parents, the teachers, as well as the general public. We also found that there's limited class time spent on climate change content. For teachers who do integrate climate change content, most students experience an average of 1 to 10 hours of instruction per year or semester. And can we all agree this is just a little too low for the defining issue of the 21st century? Teachers need support. So only 32% of our closed sample educators, so those were representative teachers, feel that they have the knowledge and skills to teach about climate change. And within this, Students are a key group to target with climate change education and action. And I ran some analysis that grouped them according to different segments. And 46% of students between grades 7 and 12 are categorized as what I called aware, meaning they understand that human-caused climate change is happening, but they do not believe that human efforts will be effective. So that is very concerning, because that means they are dealing with a level of climate anxiety, but they don't understand that there are actually solutions that are close at hand and that we can enact. So that finding of 46% of Canadian youth are categorized as aware really stayed with me. So I then developed another research project to evaluate provincial and territorial.
Ellen, we seem to have lost your voice.
And when we did this, you can see on the screen, we divided. So what's highlighted is the number of climate change education expectations that are occurring in each province or territory, and then divided them by whether they're in science, social studies, or other. And so this was interesting in and of itself, and it showed that there's a lot of range, a lot of inconsistencies between what is taught exactly. There's predominantly a lot of science. In some places, there's also a lot of focus on the social studies, and in others, there's literally none. Like in Alberta, there's no social studies focus. So then we decided to parse the data between mandatory courses and elective courses to better establish the student's experience. And so we found that there's another level of policy inconsistency that becomes evident. And so there's provinces that have more than 50% of their expectations in mandatory courses, and those are British Columbia, Nova Scotia, and the Yukon. But for the rest of the provinces, most of the expectations occur in elective courses. So that would be grade 11, grade 12, and in courses that students are choosing because they're interested in taking them. So at minimum, we need to see climate change expectations in every province that are mandatory and that are not just in science, but I would also argue in social studies. We did another level of analysis, and I'll just go through this quickly just to understand the kinds of ways that the curriculum was asking teachers to engage students in the learning. And so a very basic ranking system where 3 is some degree of acting, and we're very generous with how we addressed acting on climate change, where number 2 is some degree of critical thinking, some analysis, some interpreting, where number 1 is just focusing on the climate change concepts or impacts. So and when we did this, we found that 87% of the expectations actually fall within those first 2. So just basic understanding of the climate change concepts, impacts, science and impacts, sorry, a little bit of critical thinking, and only 13% actually got students to think about taking action. So there we have, this is how we can intervene. This is how we can address youth climate anxiety, is we need a solutions-oriented approach in our curriculum that teaches students about what the solutions are and how we can take action. We need to move way beyond just the knowledge and understanding of the climate science or the impacts. So when we look at this also against research, the research in terms of what are best practices in climate change education are not, we need to move beyond just teaching the climate science and the impacts. I'm going to just quickly move through this, and this was just the quote on the left came from my survey. And when I asked students, if they could tell their teacher what they would like to learn about climate change, the student said, I'd like to learn about and do activities that would reduce climate change instead of researching what it is. And that seems to be a lot of what students experience. So just to put forward this diagram of the learning dimensions of climate change education coming from the research. This is a synthesis diagram to show the ways that climate change education is expanding. So we have the cognitive, which is teaching the scientific consensus on climate change, fostering critical thinking skills and media literate skills. So that was really the number 1 and 2 in my research. And then we have these other dimensions, the socio-emotional. So thinking about the ways that social emotional considerations to overcome feelings of eco-anxiety, denial, and inaction. And action orientation is imperative. And then the justice focus. So learning from the climate justice movement, hearing what young people are saying, and also recognizing that this is an opportunity to address some of the systemic inequities in our policies and in our social systems. We need to have a justice focus moving forward. So just briefly on this, the most recent look at the ways that countries report on their climate change education, there were notable gaps with a pronounced emphasis solely on the cognitive knowledge over affective or action-oriented approaches. So reiterating this. So there are groups in Canada, very passionate young people who are advocating for reformed curriculum on climate. This is a group from BC called Climate Education Reform British Columbia. They've been really effective. They've met with the Minister of Education several times, and I'm quite sure they're the reason why BC is the first province to have any policy, and I wouldn't even call it a policy, statement on climate change education. I'm not going to play the video, but I'm happy to share my slides if people would like to have access to them. And I'm just going to quickly, because I know we're running out of time very quickly. The last piece of research I just really wanted, I think it's the last piece, to highlight is we know as well from research that students' sense of efficacy is very, very important in terms of how they see themselves in the world and their adoption of pro-climate behaviors. It's a much stronger determinant than their knowledge and understanding of the science or the impacts. And so we need to think about how we move our systems to be teaching those leadership skills and that sense of efficacy to create change. They need to know that, I don't want to say we don't teach the science, because we don't just need engaged young people who don't know anything, but what we're not doing is teaching that sense of efficacy and that sense of leadership. And interestingly, the last group that I showed you, the Climate Education Reform BC group, they actually come out of a leadership program in a high school in Vancouver. So it was through a leadership program that they self-organized to address climate, not through a science or biology class. So the last piece of research I would like to share is just a book chapter. A grad student, Rupinder Grewal, myself, and my colleague Paul Berger, also from Lakehead University, wrote, where we discuss the key themes that education can learn. So the formal education system can learn from the youth climate justice movement. And those themes are to adopt a justice and equity orientation in our teaching, to foster leadership and student efficacy, to find ways to get more comfortable in activism in education, to move beyond sort of this sense of neutrality, because if we look at the science, we know what we need to do, and we need to not feel so worried about being vocal, about advocating for what is the right path for humanity. Fourth, an interdisciplinary and action-oriented approach that moves beyond the cognitive dimension, but also moves beyond the disciplinary science of climate. And we also need to attend to youth well-being. So we really flesh all of those out in our chapter. And I currently have a research project where we're looking at, now that we've identified all the gaps, really profiling the case studies of what we're doing really well in classrooms across Canada. So looking at the creative and diverse ways that climate change education is being practiced. And we include both transformative and transgressive approaches. And there's a couple other pieces to this project, as well as looking at the ways that teachers' personal and professional beliefs impact how they teach in the classroom. And the third is we are keeping an ongoing tally on educational policies from ministries of education and school board divisions to see where change is happening, because currently that's not being tracked anywhere. And the very last thing I'll end on is Lakehead this year declared it a year of climate action, which was a really interesting position our senior administration took. In 2020, Lakehead confirmed its leadership on climate change and announced it was divesting from its endowment of fossil fuel stocks. And so this year, following up, was this declaration of the Year of Climate Action, which was a university-wide initiative, a call to action and an opportunity for faculty, staff, administration to come together. There was a ton of events that we ran this year, as well as installing EV stations, providing a lot of faculty training on how to teach climate change education, and creating internal research awards to improve climate change research within our institution. So with that, I will end, and I'm happy to discuss any questions. I'll end with this last quote from Christina Figueres and Tom Rivett-Carnac, who wrote a book, The Future We Choose. And Christina Figueres was the chief executive behind the Paris Climate Change Agreement. And in the book, they say, our future isn't written, it will be shaped by who we choose to be now. And I think now, almost more than even 2 years ago, that's even more imperative as we chart our way into the future. So thanks so much. I'll stop my screen share now.
Thank you very much, Ellen. It was a stimulating talk and a very wide-ranging talk. And several questions have come in that overlap or came in before you might have answered it. So I'll try and go through them. They won't necessarily be in the order that they came in, but I'll just get them up here. One of the things that CMOS, the Canadian Met and Oceanographic Society, has been active in across the country actually is our science fairs. And many of these have been occurring now, some are still to occur. And Len asked the question that climate change is not on the list of Canadian National Science Fair challenges at the national level, and what's at the national level then translates to the provincial level. How can we get climate change education and the HOPE strategy into, he said into high school education, but I would also add to elementary, and through the science fairs to get them to realize that this is an important topic?
I think that's a great idea. And I don't know how that organization works, but I'm assuming there's an executive on board. And so I imagine, I think it's sometimes it's just sending the letter, asking the question. And I would frame it as, have it as climate change solutions. So having science fair projects focused on climate change solutions, and it could be local, provincial, national, but I think it should also be located in the Canadian context. And I think that would be, that would be such a huge shift for students. That would provide, and it would send the signal to also to the science teachers too, if they don't necessarily know or are comfortable, then hopefully they can co-learn with their students. And when I do workshops with teachers, I think part of what we need to do with teachers is, climate change is complex. We all know that. And I'm sure as many folks here who are very engaged in the meteorological side, you're constantly learning and updating what we know. And teachers need to be told that it's okay for them to be constantly learning, or to say to their students, you know what, I don't know, but let's figure it out together, and let's go to some reliable, trusted sources to find the answer to this. Because the complexity of climate change is very overwhelming for a lot of teachers.
That's a very good point. And I know at our center level, Len is looking at trying to engage the local chapter, but I also know that our Jim Abraham, who is president of CMOS, is on this talk. And that may be something that CMOS is actually initiating an award at the national level. And that may be something that through their discussions, they can add to their thinking. So that's very good. one question was brought up by Helen on the power of the ripple effect. And as she pointed out, it reminds her of the anti-smoking campaigns where youth were educated on the negative health effects and were responsible for influencing their parents to quit smoking. Could such a similar approach on environmental education and climate change make sense? And where should we start on making this happen?
So I would say write letters to your MP, write to the Minister of Education in the province that you live, and or support young people. I was just interviewed yesterday by a reporter in, I think in Quebec. There's young people mobilizing there. The Climate Education Reform BC, I imagine most people are in Ontario. I'm not aware of any youth-based groups who are specifically calling for educational reforms in Ontario currently, but definitely going through the political channels. I mean, I think it's ridiculous that it's 2022 and in Ontario we don't have a clear policy on climate change education within the ministry. We have one on environment, which was from 2006, I believe. So even from that, a lot has changed. So we really need an update.
Speaking of Ontario, we have an election coming up in 3 months. It supposedly starts a month from now, but it's already started with the handouts. But there's been no peep, and I don't expect there to be any peep from the current government on climate change. How do we start raising that at the, I'll say even the local level, and make it a topic, or make it a topic on the broader sense?
Yeah, I mean, we all only have so much capacity, right? But I do think there is a lot of, it's important to recognize that sometimes trying to maneuver into the provincial level is quite difficult, but in our local communities on the municipal level, we can have huge impact. And so, I mean, it depends on the issue that you're dealing with, but in terms of municipal organizing and, ensuring that your town or community has a climate change action plan is really important. But then second to that, the interesting thing about curriculum and teachers, and this is where I've been looking at policy, but teachers, like curriculum is a guide, and teachers, especially more experienced teachers, will figure out, they can tie the curriculum to what they're doing. And what we found is it's not that there's not climate change education happening, it's just that there's not policy directives. And that's what my current research is trying to figure out, but it's only happening among those who are motivated and keen. So find those keeners, find those motivated teachers, and help, if you have expertise in an area, then offer to share that with them, because teachers are doing 1,000,001 things, and they can't be, some of them, like at the high school level, like to think of themselves as specialists, but we all need to adopt this learning mentality. And so I think that way, that the more that education can also be community focused and action oriented. Is there a project that a local school can get involved in, maybe with the municipality, to address a climate issue locally? That is like the most powerful antidote that we can do. And it's those small, they're not small, but it's that level of intervention, you scale that up and we've got serious change. And sometimes that's more effective than directly trying to intervene with a government that's already, the Ontario government is clear in terms of its ideological positioning.
Okay, well, speaking of governments, we had one question from Abby on what is Manitoba doing differently compared to the other provinces that is resulting in significantly higher number of hours of climate change education?
So Abigail, it's really interesting, and they actually don't have more. When you ask teachers about the number of hours, they don't. So it's still in alignment with that 1 to 10 hours on average that I cited. But what they do have, and it's really interesting in Manitoba, they have all of these specialized elective courses at the grade 11, grade 12, where they had the ones on mining, on forestry, on agriculture, and a lot of them did touch on climate change. I think there's lots of room to update and revise them, but they're sort of these locally developed courses. And I was really surprised to see that as well. So that huge amount of the green, there was like, I think 216 expectations overall, and I can't remember off the top of my head, but a huge amount of them are actually electives. So it's not that every student is experiencing them, it's that it would be at the grade 11, grade 12 level that students would opt in, and they just have a wide variety of these locally developed courses, which I think is a great model and something that other provinces could learn from.
Okay, and following along on the teaching side, the question from Paul was, do teachers' colleges educate new students on climate change? And do school PA days for training teachers ever include climate change education?
Great question. So in terms of faculties of education, it tends to be piecemeal. So my faculty has the expertise, and we also have a mandatory environmental ed class, so that every teacher candidate graduating from our faculty has 36 hours of environmental education. And within those 36 hours, we make sure we ready them to teach climate change appropriately. Most faculties of ed don't have mandatory environmental ed classes. If they do, like Queen's, it has, I think it's 18 or 12 hours, or they offer it as an elective. So again, so in terms of that advocacy piece, it's actually the regulator, which is the teaching license. So in Ontario, that's the Ontario College of Teachers, and they decide what our faculty has to offer, any faculty of ed, in order to offer teachers a teaching license. So there is some advocacy happening around making that mandatory, but there's been no success. So faculties of education can select. In terms of PD days, generally what happens is most of the funding, it gets allocated at the school board level, and most of the funding goes towards numeracy and literacy because those are the big pushes. And also given standardized testing, that tends to be what their performance is based on and how they're assessed. There are teachers within the boards who can offer up PD, but again, it's on a like self-volunteering, self-selection, or there may be an environmental coordinator at the school board level who can offer some of those resources, but it's piecemeal and fragmented. So in my grad class in climate change education, I encourage any teachers, they're not all teachers, but those who are working in the board to say, hey, you are an expert, pay this forward, because the boards aren't necessarily going to be leading. That being said, there are boards which are taking climate seriously. They've declared climate emergencies, they've developed climate change action plans, and they do have people within the boards who take it seriously. But again, it's up to the culture and leadership of the board.
Okay. Yeah. Just to note for people who are looking at the chat, Jim Abraham responded about the National Science Fair. There is an environment and climate change theme, and it's CMOS and the Weather Network are co-sponsoring a prize for the first time this year in that. So that's a start at that level. And thanks, Jim, for providing that information. There was an earlier question on cities where the author noted that it could have up to 60% of the greenhouse gas emissions and what is specifically being done there, and wondered if you had any thoughts on that. It relates to your recent comment about cities, if you want to expand on that.
Yeah, I think that's where we can all have the most impact, right? And if we can also engage young people in taking up these, like a localized climate action project, we're addressing the deficiencies of the current curriculum, and they're also getting real experience, and they're seeing adults take leadership. And that's what part of youth climate anxiety needs, is they need to see things happening and moving. And if we can create those direct experiences in their local neighborhoods, That's better. I see as well, John Reed posted a thing around attractive behavior involving like ads showing people oh, it's negative, right? Sorry, I read that as like pro-climate behaviors, not negative ones. But I do think we are at this tipping point as well. And, you know, with the electrification of transportation, with Subaru is bringing out a EV in the next year, that'll be around the $40,000, between $40,000 and $50,000 price point. So I'm wondering, and I know Toyota is as well in that price point, and I'm wondering how these shifts are going to start to sort of be disruptors rather than perceived in the future. We're going to start to have these very clear examples in our neighborhoods and how that may help us imagine futures, right? I do feel like, you know, we are grappling in this moment of urgency and agency, and it is this race of time. And I'm wondering how, as we have more visual cues of pro-climate behavior emerging, how anxiety might shift over time. I mean, it'll be very interesting to see.
One of the things that I noted right at the beginning, you talked about considering education as a mitigation strategy in terms of framing. And we often talk about adaptation and mitigation together. Can you expand on that a little further in selling it? Like, go back to the election, if we were to raise it locally, what's a way to frame it?
Well, you know, the research study that I cited actually shows that on scale, when education in at least a secondary level is offered on scale and is mandatory, it has reductions in greenhouse gases, which amount to other interventions such as large solar arrays. And so as we develop these strategies for reaching 2030, we need to think about all mechanisms we can bring to the table, not just our energy transport, but thinking also as education as one of those strategies to help direct people.
Okay. And I'll just note, Jim added another comment at the very end and what CMOS is doing with the teachers' comments, or with the teachers' conference that was held in concert with the Canadian Water Resources Association WET project to try and get climate, weather, and water considered together. So that's there for information for people and yourself to look at. There was one other that Ray Desjardins raised, and there was a part answer to it. And Ray is an agro meteorologist, comes from works heavily in the agricultural sector, and said, in school, do they try to teach the impact of various diets on greenhouse gas emissions?
This one has gotten a lot of controversy. And so it's interesting. I have done something called a U debate with my students around where students basically place themselves on a big U as to whether they feel that in school we should teach not to eat red meat or if we should not teach that. And my students were very divided. And it was very interesting. So there's definite, cultural pieces and relationships to red meat. And so I felt like my students were advocating, and part of the way that I can help inform this is that instead of just saying to students, like, you need to present the amount of greenhouse gases that eating industrial agriculture beef it has, but instead of just saying don't eat it, it should be a question. It should be an inquiry. Like, how can we live pro-climate lives and still nourish ourselves? and then have students go and research that and have them come up with those answers. Because as soon as you kind of say across the board, nobody can eat meat, because there is nuance around like what those diets look like, and whether you're buying meat from a true regenerative agricultural farm, where it may be actually sequestering more carbon and you're eating only a tiny amount of meat, versus, you know, you're going to McDonald's. There's nuance there. And so I think the big piece is helping students understand how to do critical thinking, how to do research, and how to find answers to these questions. Because with anything around climate, there's complexity and nuance. And so those are the most important skills that young people should be learning around climate. In some ways, is what are the key learning pieces that we need in order to face rapid uncertainty and change. And so they need critical thinking, and they need to know how to do research and how to find solutions.
Good, thank you very much. There've been a couple of others comments that are almost some answering other people's questions. So it's in the chat, and I'll let people go through and look at them. And I really appreciate everybody's input and the questions, because it's such a wide-ranging topic with different views and different outcomes. So I want to thank you again on behalf of the Centre, on behalf of CMOS, for taking the time to talk to us today, to further educate us on how we might go about educating the future generations in whatever context we can. So thank you very much. And I really hope that we can engage you again on other activities, because that type of experience is something that a lot of us certainly haven't had during our own careers, and it's really important. So thank you very much again for that.
Thanks so much for having me.
And I'm just going to wrap up now. This is the last talk of this of the 21-22 season for the Ottawa Centre, and the talks hopefully will be commencing again in the fall. So you'll be notified of that as it occurs. And also just to remind everyone about the upcoming 2022 CMOS Congress in Saskatoon, which unfortunately is going to be I shouldn't say unfortunately, which is going to be virtual again for various reasons, but it's joint with the Canadian Geophysical Union and the Eastern Snow Conference, and that starts on June the 1st, and registration is open. So people who are interested in that, please make sure it's on your calendar that you follow up. So again, thanks to everyone for attending during the year, and not only today, but during the year. And the talk will be on the YouTube, CMOS YouTube channel in a very short period of time. So thanks again, everyone.